Season 5 introduces a lot of new information that fans still need time to properly digest before the upcoming volume. After being part of so many discussions and reviews, I started noticing some general trends where people seem to misunderstand certain elements from the first volume. So I wanted to make this video to clarify a few things. I believe understanding these points correctly is important for the experience of watching the final 2 volumes, because the main misunderstanding revolves around Will and Robin's talk. Specifically, the moment where Robin shares her experience with Tammy Thompson. Here's where people are getting everything wrong. Robin did not share that story to encourage Will to take his shot with Mike. In fact, it was quite the opposite. After their talk in the hospital, Robin started suspecting that Mike was gay, and she became convinced of it when she saw Will and Mike on the field. But here's the thing. Robin's face wasn't a happy one. It was a face of pity and sorrow. She knew that Mike doesn't have romantic feelings for Will, and never will. The reason she talked about Tammy was to help Will understand that sometimes things simply don't work out the way you want them to, but even then it's okay. What matters most is being true to yourself and not seeking validation from the outside world. The answers are within means that Will doesn't need Mike in order to feel love or belonging. The answers within means that when you embrace who you truly are, the things meant for you will eventually find their way to you. In the Stranger Things universe, this literally means that once Will accepted who he really is, only then could he access the powers connected with that acceptance. Mike is Will's Tammy Thompson. Tammy was in love with Steve, just like Mike is in love with Eleven, and no matter how deeply Will loves Mike, that won't change. So for all the Byler fans out there, I'm sorry, but it's not going to happen. And honestly, that's a good thing, at least in my opinion. It represents Will's realization that he doesn't need Mike in order to be happy. Will's character arc always seemed tied to Mike in a kind of codependency. Even their first interaction shows this. Will was alone on the swing, sad, lonely, until Mike approached him and asked to be his friend. Immediately, we saw Will's world shift. He became happier, more joyful. He began to associate his happiness with Mike, believing that only Mike could make him feel understood and loved, and that only Mike could reciprocate those feelings. Robin's story about Tammy is what dismantles all of that for Will. It breaks down the walls he built over so many years, believing that this was the only path to acceptance. And once those layers of doubt and shame finally collapsed, that moment is what allowed him to access the hive mind and stop the Demogorgons. Regarding Will's powers, the Duffer Brothers gave some important information in an interview right after Volume 1. Here's what they said about Will's abilities. It's different in that he's able to channel Vecna's powers, but they're all related. Vecna and Eleven, their powers are similar. The powers aren't within him. He's able to channel these powers from Vecna and use it sort of puppeteering. Matt added, he taps into the hive mind, and then he can manipulate anything within the hive. You'll see how far he can take it as you continue to watch. But that's how he's able to manipulate the monster. He can't open a door because the door is not part of the hive mind. This answers one of the biggest questions after the release of Volume 1. The canon answer is that Will does not have powers. I know it might seem hard to accept when we literally watched him stop the Demogorgons, lifting them into the air and killing them the same way Henry did his victims. But here's the key difference between Henry and Will, and why Will doesn't actually possess telekinetic powers. Will only managed to kill the Demogorgons because they were part of the hive mind. Will cannot stop a soldier or move a car with his mind, the way Eleven or Henry can. He can only control creatures connected to the hive because he's already linked to them on a subconscious level. Will doesn't have telekinetic powers. His abilities are more like manipulation powers, and this will likely be explained further in Season 2. Put simply, Will wasn't the one who stopped and killed those Demogorgons. Will manipulated Vecna into stopping and killing the monsters, and honestly, this makes far more sense when you look at the way the Demogorgons died. Their deaths were exactly like the way Vecna killed his victims, down to the details. It would be incredibly difficult for Will to replicate that technique perfectly, but if he was actually manipulating Vecna, then the killing method makes complete sense. Here's another piece of information from that same interview. Vecna completely underestimates Will. He perceives him in the way that so many others have in his life, which is as weak as nothing, as incapable of achieving anything great, so he completely underestimates him in that moment. Whether that's going to happen again, you'll have to watch Volume 2. This is why I'm sure things are not as simple as Will has powers now and he'll use them in the upcoming battle. If it were that easy, why is he still unconscious? We know from the trailer that there's a scene with Joyce and Mike at the radio station, and Will is unconscious on the sofa. This must happen right after the library attack, and Will likely collapses after using those powers. Maybe tapping into Vecna's abilities traps him inside Vecna's mind, which would explain why he hasn't woken up. Maybe will encounter Holly and Max there, and together they'll save the children and return to the real world for the final battle. Let me know what you think of this theory. I truly think it has potential. The last thing I want to talk about is Dustin's character in Season 5. Although I'm one of those who doesn't fully love his personality shift, I understand exactly where it comes from. And for those saying he's a poorly written character because he doesn't act like his usual self, I believe that's completely wrong. This is exactly what makes him such a great character. He's not one-dimensional. People change, especially teenagers. This is the time when they're figuring out who they are, constantly reinventing themselves. People have misunderstood Dustin from the very beginning. He has always been the type to latch onto role models and imitate them. First it was Steve, then it was Eddie. This ties directly into the fact that Dustin never had a paternal figure. He projected that paternal role onto Steve and Eddie to the point of copying them. He did the same thing at the end of Season 2 when he copied Steve's hairstyle to get the courage to ask Max to dance. Now, Dustin imitates Eddie's personality because that's how he's dealing with his grief. This is exactly why his character took such a dramatic 180-degree turn. He hasn't changed. He's grieving. And everyone grieves differently. It makes absolute sense for his character. How would you react if your hero died in front of your eyes when you were alone together, sacrificing himself to save a town that sees him as a monster, mocks him, and blames him for everything? If I were Dustin, I'd probably have the same bitterness and anger in my eyes too. But that's exactly what makes him feel so real. Even when awful things happen, life doesn't stop. It's up to you to adapt. Combine that with a classic coming-of-age journey, trying to find his place, getting humbled when his arrogance backfires, facing real-world consequences from people who have no idea what he's gone through and don't care about his role in saving the town. Learning to navigate that is part of growing up. I also feel like the way everyone treats Dustin isn't entirely fair. Even if he does deserve some of it, only 7 months have passed since Eddie's death, and that's nowhere near enough time to process grief, especially for a teenager. And unlike the others, Dustin doesn't have a strong emotional support system. Will always had Jonathan. Mike and Eleven have each other. Lucas has Max. Dustin has no one in that sense. He had Steve, and I expected Steve to talk things out with him, but apparently he didn't. To be honest, I was more disappointed in how Steve handled the situation than I was in Dustin's behavior. Steve is the bigger person here, and he has always been a role model for Dustin, and he knows it. But instead of trying to help Dustin through this phase he's going through, Steve is too preoccupied with winning Nancy back. Again, I'm not saying this is bad from a writing perspective. In fact, I really love what they did here with all the characters having their own interests and pursuing what they want. It adds complexity and makes them feel like real humans, not storybook characters who always do the morally correct thing. I genuinely like how everyone is written so far, and I only wanted to point out why we're seeing such a drastic change in Dustin and help you understand where it all comes from. Even the dialogue he has with Steve, where he's constantly arguing, acting sarcastic, and being mean, is just an act, a facade. In reality, at least in my opinion, all of Dustin's harshness comes from fear. He's terrified of losing someone else close to him, so he builds this mask to hide behind. It's easier to push Steve away and keep up this prickly personality than to actually talk about what he's feeling. I really resonate with Dustin on this. I was a lot like him in high school. It was easier to push everyone away than open up about my feelings, especially with my parents. It was easier to maintain this arrogant, sarcastic personality as a coping and defense mechanism, even though deep down, I wasn't that person at all. And that's exactly what's happening with Dustin. It's especially sad because in trying so hard to keep Eddie's memory alive, he ends up breaking the promise he made to him. Eddie told him never to change, to stay true to himself in a world that constantly tries to shape you. And unfortunately, Dustin is the one who changed the most between seasons. But I don't think he'll stay like this until the end of the series. I believe he'll eventually have a heart-to-heart conversation with Steve, and things will return to normal. Dustin apologizing for being such a prick, and Steve apologizing for not being there for him, I can easily imagine a scene like that. We know they're in the Upside Down, and based on the trailer, Nancy and Jonathan will head to the lab. That means Dustin and Steve will be left alone. They'll probably start arguing again, and Dustin might say something about Nancy, calling out how Steve is so focused on her that he doesn't notice what's happening around him. That could be the moment Steve finally acknowledges it and their friendship begins to heal. Something along those lines. What I want to say in the end is that I fully understand where all of this is coming from with Dustin. It seems like the theme of this season is how everyone deals with trauma. Dustin deals with his grief over Eddie. Hopper confronts the trauma of losing his daughter. Will finally faces his deepest fears. We even saw Henry suffering from what happened to him in the cave. Nancy and Mike's parents are in critical condition at the hospital. So Dustin's character arc this season is about how he overcomes all of this without sinking. I truly believe that in the end, he'll return to his usual self, honoring the promise he made to Eddie. But he needs to get there in his own way, maybe with a little help from his friends, a small push from the people who care about him. Hopefully this video makes sense and helps clarify some of the information we got from Volume 1. I truly believe that getting these things right will improve your viewing experience for Volume 2. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments, or let me know if there's a particular topic you want me to cover. Thank you for watching.